All right, so here we are. This section of the textbook, we are talking about what the textbook chapter is called Naturalistic Inquiry. But what this really is looking at is ethnographic studies. So we can think about, anthropology going into a community culture, sort of being a fly on the wall, trying to describe habits, interactions, festivals, patterns, taking notice of the people and the dress and the homes and just the way in which culture operates right now. The value of this is for a couple of reasons. Number one, you might be studying a culture that doesn't document its own behaviors, and so you want to sort of learn more about that culture, right? And the second thing is like if you come in as an outsider and you act as a fly on the wall as opposed to being involved, which we'll talk about the difference here momentarily. Um, People from the outside can have a better sort of like they can better observe what's happening in detail as opposed to the people who are actively engaged in the actions day to day. So when you are actively engaged in sort of different in various actions, behaviors, beliefs, etc., day to day, you sort of lose sight. It becomes automatic for you. So you actually within a culture are not always the best person to describe what your culture is all about. Um, there are plenty of articles, especially in the last 10 years, possibly 20 years, but really sort of ramped up in the last 20 years, where people are upset, we'll say, or very critical of outsiders coming in and trying to describe cultures. Uh, for reasons of like, either you get into like colonialist theory or appropriation, you just sort of like protectionism that happens within culture. Then they say, hey, how dare you as an outsider come in and comment on our culture? There are concerns. Let's not downplay the concerns, but let's also recognize that outsiders, or excuse me, let's also recognize that when you are involved in a culture, you are not always necessarily in the best place to describe that culture because of one, that culture sort of seems what we call quote unquote normal to you, right? So you can't see the nuances from the inside. And two, like you have biased understandings of what's going on in your culture, right? And so there are very good reasons as to why we might appreciate someone on the outside observing cultural behaviors from which they are not a part of. All right. You go back, a few hundred years. This obviously happened with, anthropologists going overseas and sort of interacting with individuals who had never interacted with the outside world before. When people were sort of more clearly divided and people didn't travel as much. Anytime anyone would go to sort of a new place and time, there were very different cultures. Right now, the world is becoming more and more homogenous. We share a lot of information. So, as an American, if I go over to Europe, there's a lot of things that are very similar that don't seem that foreign to me. Um, in today's anthropology work or ethnography work, it could even happen sort of like within a culture. So you have subcultures. So there are plenty of ways to sort of say, there's 330 million people in the United States. There are ways in which you can sort of understand that people in different areas of the country, people in different sections of different neighborhoods and different cities act differently, behave differently, have different values, sort of move through life differently. And so it's important to sort of notice these cultural differences. All right. All right. So we'll talk about sort of like the inside outside perspective um, upcoming. All right. So naturalistic inquiry focus on how people behave when they are absorbed in genuine life experience in a natural setting. All right. So this is opposed to a lab setting. Okay. So you can sort of understand, and we talked a little bit about the Hawthorne effect. When people know that they are being observed, they are going to behave differently, right? So the whole people meters situation where Nielsen would take a family and say, come into our laboratory and watch TV together. We want to study your TV habits. People are going to watch TV differently when they know that they're being observed. Naturalistic inquiry is how can I observe people in a natural setting where they're going to continue to behave in the exact same ways that they would behave whether or not I'm observing them or not, right? Now this can become tricky, right? The first part is, if you are this sort of like very true, like fly on the wall observer, you just sort of stand back and hopefully nobody notices you, right? However, you do get in these tricky situations where there are moments where you do need to be seen by the people you are observing, because you might start to interact with them in order to ask them clarifying questions. If it's a small enough group or a small enough culture, they're going to notice that you are an outsider, and just they might not know that you're a researcher, but just the fact that you're an outsider might cause those individuals to act differently. So an example of this might be if you want to study like Bible study culture, right? Like evangelical churches, and they have these little Bible study groups. Let's say it's made up of 15 people, and you're really interested, like what goes on in these groups, on Wednesday nights, like what's going on at people's houses, and they're having potlucks, and this is a really weird thing, if you're not connected with church or Bible studies. So you would have to join a Bible study group, right? And there should be a recognition from you, like even if the people don't know that you're doing research, you join the group, but the people know that you're a new person in the group. So the first several meetings, these individuals are going to, like, if they want you to join their group, if they want you to be a part of their faith, a part of their church, whatever, they're going to be very, very welcoming to you. You're not going to know about all the behind the scenes drama that happened last week at the Bible study when you weren't there. You don't get to see the conflict right away and the tension right away. So you come in and the individuals are going to sort of put on their best behavior because they want to be welcoming to you, and they don't want to air their dirty laundry in front of a new person, regardless of whether or not you're a researcher, right? So it can be tricky to sort of get into sort of like a pure naturalistic setting in order to observe various cultural patterns, behaviors, etc. But that's what a naturalistic inquiry is aiming for, all right? The phenomenon should be studied in its natural context, and obviously there's pros and cons. So the pro of this is hopefully can sort of see how people behave when they don't think that they're being observed. The con of this is you can't always necessarily control for variables. So you're not allowed to do any sort of manipulation to the environment in order to control for various variables. All right. So it can be difficult to figure out, what various stimulus are with regard to people's behaviors and how they're acting. All right. So there's pros and cons to this. Obviously, if you take people and you put them into a lab setting, the con of that is like they know that they're being observed. But the pro is that if you put people into a lab setting, now you can control all of these various variables and stimulus that you're going to interject into the setting. All right. So naturalistic inquiry, ethnographic research, try to be a fly on the wall and just observe a new culture. What's going on in this new culture? I want to learn something about it. All right, observations. When I'm studying another person, I can try to look at their behavior in two different ways. The first is phenomenology. The second is interpretive. Phenomenology is the belief that the object of interest be examined without any preconceived notions or a priori expectations. It's difficult, but it's ideal, but it's difficult to achieve. What this means is that you try to go in and try to be a very objective observer. You try to take all your biases and prejudices and you try to put them in the wastebasket and say, I just want to observe people and just describe what's happening. Obviously, this is difficult to achieve because you have biases that you are unaware of because you yourself are sort of like in the wash of your own culture. And so there are things that you do that you don't even recognize you do, right? So again, this gets back to the first slide where I was mentioning, there are people who are very, very concerned and critical of outsiders coming into cultures to view them for reasons of appropriation, etc. But again, like we are all awash in our own values and belief systems and things that we sort of see as normal every day. People from the outside can give us insight about that we are completely unaware of, right? Possibly a good example of this, and it's fresh on my mind. So we just got done with wrestling season. So coaching, right? Any sort of like when you're coaching kids or you're coaching anybody, you have really, really good athletes on your team. But there's like, there are things that they do, there are habits that they have that they don't even know that they have. So part of the role of a coach isn't just to teach a kid a new move, right? But it's also to see what sort of consistent behavioral patterns that kid engages in that is actually stopping them from sort of getting to the next level of competition, right? So if they have a little, like a tell, right? So in gambling, if, people have a tell. It's like if they have a good hand, like people have these little nonverbal cues you try to pick up on to see, people don't even know that they're doing these things, right? So a role of the coach is to look at someone and say, look, like um, every time you hit this move, like your hand is in just like a weird little position. You're not lowering your shoulder enough. You're not, moving your feet in the way that you're supposed to be moving your feet. Your head's down and your head's up, right? And these are things that we don't even know we're doing, or the kid doesn't even know he's doing because it's so habitual, all right? And at the same time, the researcher has various habits. So I, as a researcher, I look out at this new culture and I might be focusing in on things that don't matter that much, but my attention is drawn to that because I think that it's important, because my biases or my prejudice deem that it's important based on my own cultural background. All right. So it's very, very difficult to achieve. It's hard to be objective, but a phenomenological approach strives to be objective in the viewing of another culture. All right. An interpretive approach is the researcher just sort of full on embraces, like, look, I can't be objective, I'm completely subjective. So they sort of write themselves into the observations. They talk about the limitations of their own viewing patterns, right? So the researcher can't escape from providing his or her own interpretation. So they just sort of more own it. They say, look, this is my culture. Or excuse me, they would say, like, here are the cultural patterns I saw in this other culture. I understand them based on my own cultural patterns, and I see how this culture deals with issues of family. I think I'm interpreting their family situation right because this is how my culture deals with issues of family, but I might be completely wrong, but that's the only way that I can understand new and different experiences with regard to family. All right, is by looking at it through the lens of what do I know about family, and what I know about family is how my own culture deals with this issue of family. All right, male-female relationships, right? Gender norms in a culture. I might look at a culture and I might see very different gender norms, right? Gender roles between men and women. But the only way that I can really sort of figure out is, like, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it a different thing? Is by understanding what gender roles in my own culture are like. And so, yeah, there's this constant tension of trying to be objective, trying to be a fly on the wall. I'm just going to write down what I see. But then also recognizing that even what I see is biased by my own preconceived notions and my own preconceived biases. Excuse me. Okay. All right. So ethnography, it's rooted in anthropology, which I discussed on the first slide, right? It looks at cultural traditions, behaviors of other cultures, right? Now there's a lot more reflexivity on one's own culture, which we'll talk about. Again, there's pros and cons to that, right? The pros of being reflective on your own culture is that you can have a little bit more sympathy, empathy. You can sort of recognize the faults of your own culture, or the biases that you bring to the table when studying other cultures. But again, the con of this is that if I'm just reflecting on my own culture, sometimes the best people to observe our behaviors are people who aren't us. Sometimes the best people to observe and give us good insight on some of the faults of our culture are people who aren't involved in our culture, because I am so inundated and awashed in my own culture, I can't necessarily, I'm not necessarily in the best position to understand my culture. And it's the same way, again, if we take this like athlete metaphor. If you're an athlete, even the best athletes in the world have coaches, because those coaches sort of see these little ticks and these little behavioral changes that an athlete just does automatically, and they can't be reflexive on it because they don't even know that it's happening, right? An athlete might think they know what's going on, but it does help to have an outside perspective to sort of look in on your behavior and say, yeah, I think this is you think this is the problem, but actually your problem is something else that you are completely blind. You have a completely blind spot for. All right. So rooted in anthropology. All right. So there's a couple ways. There's like three forms of ethnographic research that we're going to talk about. Right. The first is just like straight up ethnography. All right, so you need to know these. This will be on the test. Ethnography, looking at cultural traditions, behaviors of other cultures as an outsider, right? Fly on the wall mentality. You go in, you see a new culture, you're just writing down how do they behave, how do people interact with each other. You might look at gender differences. How do the men behave? How do the women behave? You might look at certain patterns that come up with regard to, okay, these individuals, they work 5 days a week and then they take 2 weeks off. Obviously, that doesn't happen in every culture. How are marriage ceremonies? You're gonna write that down. Well, what sort of like festivals do they have? Is it a religious festival? Is it just a seasonal festival? Right? You're writing down patterns. What sort of celebrations do they participate in? How do those celebrations work? Right? All of these things are just you just writing things down, trying to be very objective. You're not judging these things. You're not trying to change these things. You're just writing down how does a culture work, right? That's ethnography. One of the more famous studies that you need to know, specifically as a comm scholar, is this Phillipson study from 75, 76. So the title of the study, you can find this study on the library's website and journal article, right? Is it's called Talking Like a Man in Teamsterville. And what Phillipson did was go to this sort of working class white neighborhood in Chicago, very blue collar, one of those areas of Chicago where it's like everybody goes to the same high school, and right out of high school, all the boys and girls are paired up, so they're all going to marry each other. The boys go off and work at the factory. They get a union job at the factory for 50 years, and the women maybe take some sort of small part-time jobs, but they all kind of like live in the same neighborhood. And then 50 years later, they retire, and then they die, and then they have kids, and the kids go work at the factory. It's this very sort of like isolated ecosystem of growing up together, marrying your neighbors, right? And then sort of like working at the factory that's in town, right? Not an unusual way for lots of areas to sort of operate throughout the 20th century. We've obviously changed in the 21st century with more people going off to college and traveling across the country, but this is not unusual for sort of like blue collar, non-educated, or excuse me, non-college educated areas, right? It's like get a high school diploma. That's what you need in order to start some sort of apprenticeship in order to get a job at the local, factory. All right. So Phillipson went in and they studied, what's going on in this neighborhood. How do they talk to each other? What are their communication patterns? So it did look at like communication patterns between men and women, communication patterns among men, communication patterns among women, communication patterns from fathers to sons. And then they also looked at things like the communication patterns that happened between the people who stayed in the town and then like that like one or two kid from the high school who got really good grades and like went off to college and then came back. So now it's like you have a graduating class of, let's say, 100 students, and a handful of them go off to college. And then a couple of them come back, and Phillipson is like, what's that new dynamic like? Right? This whole idea of like, oh, college boys back, like, look, college boys too good for us. Like these sort of, ways in which people sort of, rib each other, etc. And so Phillipson was really interested in that, like what happens when, like interested in a lot of things, but also interested in like what happens when somebody leaves Teamsterville for a while, and Teamsterville is a made up area, or excuse me, it's a made up name for an actual real neighborhood in Chicago. What happens when somebody leaves and then someone tries to come back and they try to sort of reassimilate into the communication patterns of their neighborhood, right? And so that's what Phillipson was looking at. And then with those individuals, so let's say that I'm born and raised in Teamsterville. Let's say I go away to college. College has a different communication strategy as far as language and as far as grammar and, sort of quote unquote proper standard English. What happens when I go back is I sort of switch back into the old ways of talking, vocabulary, right? So this is a term known as code switching, right? When I'm with my sort of like college educated proper friends, I speak in a way and I hold my pinky up when I drink my tea, right? And I go home, I sort of slip back into the slang. This sometimes happens a little bit when I go home to Illinois. When I go back home to Illinois within a couple of days, there's the sort of like there's a drawl that kind of comes out. My vowels get a little bit longer, right? Chicago, like that, like that sort of vocal pattern just sort of starts to come out with me when I'm hanging out around people with whom I grew up with. And so your accent changes a little bit. The words you use, the vocabulary you use changes a little bit. And so Phillipson studied this. Phillipson was interested in how do people change vocabulary behaviors, change sentence structures based on sort of where they're at in life, right? And this is, this is things that communication scholars do. They study linguistic patterns, right? So Phillipson went in, fly on the wall. Obviously, some of the things that Phillipson ran into was like people, everyone in Teamsterville knows each other. Now they see this research and they're like, who's this? Who's this person? This is a different person. Are those individuals going to sort of change up some of their patterns or not? So it's definitely a limitation. Okay, so ethnography, just straight up ethnography, viewing people's patterns. All right, the second form of ethnography is known as critical ethnography. All right, this framework is framework towards invoking change. Excuse me there. I don't know why I'm using the black ink here. That's ridiculous. All right, invoking change. Research ought to create change. Why might this be a problem? So this is like someone goes in, they study a culture, and then they say, okay, based on the way that this culture is acting, we need to do some things, right? We need to change some things. There's some power dynamics wrong that are inefficient here, so we need to sort of change some things around. They almost treat culture like somebody else's culture like a problem, and so they need to create some change. Obviously, the couple of reasons that this is a problem is like number one, like a researcher who's only been involved with that culture, let's say they studied it for a year, like that culture's been around for a long time. Like, what do they know just because they went and like checked it out for a year? The second thing is like, how do you know all the people in that culture even, or in that culture that you studied wanted change in the first place? All right. Now, some people in that culture might want change, right? So critical ethnography comes out of like critical theory, deals with like power dynamics. So let's say that I go into an urban area and I'm like, there's a lot of problems in this urban area and I need to study the sort of urban landscape. And now I need to come in and I know, right, quotes here, how to fix the schools or how to fix the government, or I'm going to implement change in homeless policies. I might actually have good reasons or good ideas that could help change these, excuse me, change these things, right? However, again, just because I went and studied it for a year doesn't mean that I understand all the complexities of the neighborhood. And two, the question becomes do the individuals in this community even want these changes, or if these changes were implemented, would they gravitate towards upholding these new patterns that I've put in place, right? So one of the problems one of the limitations of policy change is that you might have the right answer for, let's say, changing inner city school system. And then I implement that change, right? And that's fantastic. But the big obstacle is getting people, because all of us are creatures of habit, getting people to adopt new habits, right? So even if the individuals I'm talking to say like, yeah, we want this new school system that Josh has invented, and will actually create higher graduation rates, etc. Once you put those mechanisms in place, people are still stuck in decades of old patterns, and it's really, really hard to get out of those habits, right? And it's hard for any of us to get out of our habits, right? Like, for instance, like I know exactly what I need to do for diet and exercise. Someone could, I can go on YouTube right now and someone says like, go to the gym this many times and do these workouts and eat this food. And I'm like, yes, and I'm good at it for like a day, and then I'm like, yeah, but I've been, drinking wine and eating pie for like 20 years, and that's awesome. So I'm going to fall back into my habits very, very quickly. All right. So even though I know what I need to do, it's hard to change those patterns because those patterns have been around for so long. Okay. All right. And finally, autoethnography. I have a huge problem with autoethnography. I'll be completely transparent in this. People do, researchers obviously partake in autoethnography. I don't like it. And I have a huge bias against it. But nobody has to like what I have to say, so they can continue to do it, right? That's why we have various research methods with regard to conducting research. So if you like autoethnography, continue to do it. I have problems with it. All right, but this is the third one. So you had ethnography. Critical ethnography is about studying a culture and then trying to implement some changes to that culture. Ethnography is just like straight up observe and tell us what you saw. Critical ethnography is what did you observe, and now it's about changing. Autoethnography is the research examines his or her own life as a site of knowledge construction, right? The problem with this is that researchers who do this kind of work very quickly slip into this idea that because I experience something as a person who identifies as X, that must be a stand-in or some sort of knowledge-based system for understanding lots of other people who also identify with me. All right. So let's say that I do research that says, growing up in a small town Midwest, right? What's it like to sort of grow up in like small, lower working class Midwest America? And I write some sort of autoethnographic research about myself and my own experiences, and then I write it down, and I'm like, look, everyone, I created research about what it, about sort of like small work, like lower working class, blue collar, Midwest, whatever. Someone could read that and be like, is that a stand-in for everybody who grew up in like small Midwest, lower working class, blue collar America? Or is that just like Josh just had that one experience, right? There's nothing generalizable about autoethnographic research. It just becomes me sort of doing this like quasi-academic like memoir that I want to act as if it's a part of knowledge construction when really it's just like me writing some stories about how I grew up. Now, those stories of how I grew up, you say like these are important stories and we should document them and everybody should sort of write down their experiences. But I don't really know if that counts as knowledge production for, again, sort of these like large, generalizable, important pieces of information with regard to, what it's like to, like grow up in like small Midwest, blue collar, working class America, right? It's like, Josh, you had one story. That doesn't mean that it's a stand-in for anybody else, right? It just means that like you wrote a memoir about yourself. I don't really think that's research, all right? It also becomes this what people refer to as navel gazing, right? Be careful of navel gaze. Like just be careful of staring at your own belly button, right? There is something about academics and academic research that should be about getting out of your own head, getting out of your own experience. So, some things that I talk to my freshman students about is if you're going to come to college and you're just going to navel gaze, you're going to sit there and say like everything in every class should be about me and how I feel about it and should somehow be filtered through the experience that I have and the experiences I know. Then my question is like, why are you spending a whole lot of time and money to come to college to learn about things you already know about because you experience them, right? There's something about the academic life that should be about you searching for things and learning about things that are completely outside of your head, right? It's like you should go to college and say like, I want to learn about stuff I haven't experienced that I know nothing about that can't be filtered through my experience, right? There's no reason to spend $50,000 in 4 years in the prime of your life staring at your belly button and trying to go to school so that we can affirm the experiences you already had. Like you can do that at your house, right? And again, there's nothing wrong with like journaling this stuff, writing this stuff down, writing some sort of memoir, right? There's nothing wrong with these things at all. Like fantastic artwork and novels and biographies, and it like comes out of this stuff, right? But I don't think it's academic, right? Academics should be about learning things that you don't know by looking at the world outside of you, all right? So yeah, we have this question of like, what is research for? Is research about me sitting down and typing out my own experiences, or is research about me trying to find broader truths about the world? And the only way I can do that is to look at patterns outside of myself. If I just say isolated and sort of keep focusing inward, that doesn't do anything to sort of broaden to try to understand the larger world and the connectedness of the larger world outside of me. All right. So I'm not a fan of autoethnography. People do it. You should know about it. But anytime a researcher, an academic, is just steeped in like continually writing about their own experiences on and on and on and acting as if that is some sort of large, deep understanding of knowledge production, I have questions, right? Now, that's not to say that every once in a while, like, let's say you write like 10 academic papers and then you have like one paper where you're like, I'm going to do something autoethnographic. I'm going to try to situate myself. And I think that's fine. I think it's appropriate. I know people who do that, and I think that's reasonable. But if you're constantly just sort of like going back to, how do I feel about this? What are my experiences in this world? And I'm going to act as if that's somehow a stand-in for generalizable knowledge. I think those claims are dubious, and I think that we should do a better. Researchers should do a better job with trying to not talk about ourselves so much. interpretive approach, recognize our own biases and prejudice and say, look, here's my experiences, and based on that, I'm going to view the outside world differently. I'm going to interpret the outside world differently. But again, we should always be looking outward, external, right? Look for the truth outside of ourselves. Don't just keep looking inward and say, like, I think I can find something inside of myself that is truthful. That's just a bunch of navel gazing, and it's not very exciting. It gets very, very boring after a while. All right, finally, well, a couple more slides, but when we're designing ethnographic studies, all right, we have what's called emergent data. So the changes to the study happen as you kind of continue on with the study. So you might go in with a good plan, right? But you have to be willing to be flexible with regard to changing the pattern, right? So you might go in and you say, I want to study the religious activities of this new culture, and you get in there and you start realizing that they also engage in other activities and festivals that aren't religious. The people of that culture, you might start to figure out like the religion isn't the interesting stuff. They might, you might find out like religion is a part of that culture, but something far more interesting is this other sort of like celebratory, like family festival that goes on, or seasonal festival, right? Like the equinox, right? Or something like, so you start sort of, you go in with a bit of a plan, but you realize that because I'm not a part of the culture, I don't know what's going on in the culture. So I don't necessarily know what is of interest or important to the people in that culture. So I have to be willing to be flexible. All right, case study, you're going to study a single situation or event. You cannot generalize the findings of that single thing, but you do write it down. You say recording and documenting patterns of behavior is important so that we can better understand the culture itself. All right, so first and foremost, decide what to study. All right, find the culture you want to study. Gain access by building trust with individuals within that community. Again, you can't just go in and say, hey, everyone, I'm a stranger and I'm here to like study you. You should go in and gain trust with those individuals. We'll talk about this on the last slide. The role of the observer is to be deeply involved, or excuse me, you have this sort of tension between being deeply involved in the culture and being dispassionate. So you might, fly on the wall, be dispassionate, don't put your own feelings into it, but also like you have to interact with the like there's going to come a time where you are interacting with the individuals with whom you are sort of from whom you are engaging or observing. All right, so you have to sort of constantly play around with this tension. Like, what's my role here? Should I just be observing, or I'm going to have to interact at some point? How do I interact in a way that's respectful? How do I ask questions in a way that's respectful? Right, and again, this goes back to things like building trust. The length of the observation. How long should you study a culture? This is on the test. You study it to the point of what's known as the point of saturation. The point of saturation in qualitative research is there's no like hard and fast rule that says like study the culture for 1 year, right? Or study the culture for 3 months. The point of saturation is study the culture until you study the event or the culture or whatever it is you're studying until you start to run out of new observations, until you run out of new things that are emerging, right? How many people should I interview, right? You interview people until you start to realize that people are giving the same answers over and over again and you're not gaining new information. So the point of saturation is like your research has become saturated with the same interview answers. You're observing the same things, right? You're not gaining any new information by sticking around and collecting more data in a qualitative manner. So you're like, okay, I think I can stop now because there's no new information coming out that is useful. So maybe I take my research, I go and publish it, I go and write about it. I might come back later, but right now we have reached a point where I'm not gaining anything new. So let's go ahead and stop this exercise. All right. And then finally, what to observe as the study goes forth. You'll gravitate to interesting details once unknown. So again, you'll enter into a culture that you have a little bit of knowledge about, but like you're going to get talking to people, and people are going to, people are going to tell you about interesting festivals or religious activities or some sort of, interesting gender norms. And you kind of, you just kind of go down those rabbit holes as they come forth. All right, when you collect data analysis, first and foremost, field notes, write down and observe things, right? Again, fly on the wall stuff, just kind of sit back and write down things that you find of interest. Grounded theory, you build the theory as the observations dictate. So if there are strong themes of class, drama, gender, etc., use a known theory. It's not necessary, right? So if you see certain patterns of gender norms, you see very strong gender norms, you might say like, there's something really interesting. Like maybe if I go back and I look at some theories on feminism, like this might be of interest, right? There's like very clear class divides, or there's very clear hierarchies and power structures in this culture. I'm going to study a little bit of Marxism to see if Marxism might have something interesting to say with regard to what I am observing. Dialectical analysis is when you look at the tensions within the culture. So again, all cultures are going to have their tensions. Not everybody in every culture agrees with each other, right? So in the United States, one way to look at it, like politics, like Democrat, Republican Party, there are tensions. If an outsider came in to study the, political culture of the United States, like looking at the tensions between people who are more likely to vote Democrat versus Republican, like that's something that is of interest. Metaphor analysis, what fantasy themes, myths, figures of speech, communication help keep the culture together. So are there certain stories? Are there certain narratives? Are there certain religious stories? So if you go to if you go to India, let's say, and you see some of the architecture, you go into the bookstores, you're going to see a lot of gods and goddesses out of the Hindu religion, right? And you're like, these gods and goddesses, these characters, these stories are sort of plastered everywhere, all over the streets. They're on shirts, they're on houses, there's posters on buildings, there are sculptures on temple, like they're everywhere. You're like, these are the themes that hold this culture together. Like pay attention to that, right? If you go like there's something to be said about being engaged in American culture and seeing sports paraphernalia everywhere. You're like, wow, it's like sports holds America together in a way that it doesn't hold, let's say, Indian culture together, right? So religious themes, you could have something like sports, branding, so like corporate logos, right? Are you walking around certain cultures and you see certain corporate logos everywhere, or certain stores with certain brand names? That's what you want to pay attention to. What are the stories? I've mentioned this before in some of my classes. I usually travel, not during COVID, but I try to visit like 4 or 5 countries every year. And every time before I go to a new country, I always try to read a book that is well known in that country, sort of like by like the famous author of that country. Because it's just like a small little way for me to sort of say like, this book is widely read and understood and has a lot of influence in this country. I just kind of want to read it so I can kind of a little bit, right, kind of better understand the culture I'm going into. And some of the stories are very, very different than maybe like an American author's story, right? So you go to Denmark and it's like, okay, you're gonna read read The Little Mermaid, right? You go down to Colombia, you read Gabriel Garcia Marquez. You go to Spain, it's like, I'm going to read Don Quixote, right? You just kind of read some of the stories or a couple of the religious texts that are very, very important in those countries. And then you get there and you're like, okay, like I have a little bit of understanding of like one of the interesting myths, fantasy, cultural narratives that is foundational, right? Not entirely, but partially foundational and sort of like holding this country together. If someone was to come to America, I would, probably recommend some of like the founding father stuff, right? It's like if you're going to go to DC and try to have a better appreciation for like how it's set up, it's like you should like know some things about the founding fathers, Declaration of Independence, 1776 kind of stuff. It's like that sort of like patriotic revolution narrative, right? Is very like foundational and sort of like how Washington, D.C. is set up. So it's like learn a little bit about it, right? Before you go to Gettysburg, it's like read the Gettysburg Address and you kind of have just a bit of a different understanding of that area, all right? And then finally, as you write up your analysis, you could do it as like what's called telling a tale. So you write it as a story. So this is what we're talking about. That's what we're getting into next week. My book, Homeless Narratives from the Streets. So this was my PhD dissertation that then I kept about 75% of it. I added some stuff to it. I got with a publisher. I edited through the work and made a book out of it, right? But this was an ethnographic project. So it's a qualitative research project for my dissertation. I was working at a homeless shelter. So this is part of that like building trust in the community. I've been working in and around people who are homeless and homeless shelters since I was about 19. When I wrote this, I was about 29, 30 years old. I started my dissertation. So a lot of people who were homeless, who I was interacting with and interviewing, already knew me as like a person in the neighborhood who was interested in this stuff, right? They had known me for years, kind of like around these areas. They'd seen me like, out on the streets working with people who are homeless, or like, doing shifts at the shelter or whatever it was, right? So that's part of like the building trust, right? So when it came to like, hey, can I interview you about your experiences as being homeless? People were more trusting and more willing to share information with me because, um, yeah, they just sort of like knew me. And yeah, so it'd be different if I was like straight off the streets, like straight, like nobody knew who I was. I just walked in and be like, hi, my name's Josh. I'm doing some interviews. Who wants to talk to me about their life story? Like that wasn't going to work, right? But these were a lot of individuals that I knew, or just not in like not in like any sort of like deep friendship way, but like just kind of knew me, either in like a professional way as like someone who worked around the shelter, or somebody they could like seen out on the streets, handing out blankets and sandwiches at night, that kind of thing. All right, so that's probably like that building trust. And then I wrote this up as sort of like as some sort of narrative. So the first half of the book is all like the lit review stuff, and the second half is like me trying to tell the story of what it's like to be homeless through this amalgamation of everyone I interviewed to kind of create this like larger narrative for understanding sort of homelessness, and all the issues that surround it, like the not the sort of like policy issues, but just sort of like the personal individual ways in which people kind of move through this, from like losing jobs, or addiction, to like what's it like to sleep on the streets, and then like how do you work through the welfare system, what's it like to move through like a homeless shelter, like what are your goals, like what gets you out of bed every morning, and you kind of create like a story that makes sense out of all these interviews you collected, to make like a nice through story that captures multiple aspects. All right, so that's what we're getting into next week. All right, so ethnographic research. The big thing, like, know the difference between ethnography, critical ethnography, autoethnography. Um, that's the big thing here. All right, okay, I will see you all next time.